The fishing trip was quiet, the sea calm as we drifted. Then the rod bent violently and the line snapped with a loud pop. A massive shadow surfaced, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Before I could react, it surged toward the boat. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. Mark Chun stood on the deck of his small boat, the Sea Whisper, gently bobbing in the choppy waters off Oahu's north shore. At 42, he was no stranger to the ocean's whims, but today felt different. The overcast sky cast a gloomy pall over the usually vibrant blue waters, and a stiff breeze carried the tang of salt and a hint of impending rain. He double-checked his scuba gear, methodically going through each piece of equipment. Tank pressure? Check. Regulator? Check. Buoyancy compensator? Check. As he worked, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He'd done solo dives before, but something about today's expedition to explore the wreck of the Midnight Star, a cargo ship that sank decades ago, felt off. "You're being ridiculous," Mark muttered to himself, shaking his head. "It's just another dive." But as he glanced at the roiling sea, he couldn't help but remember the recent reports of increased shark activity in the area. The local dive shops had been buzzing with talk of more frequent sightings, particularly of tiger sharks. Mark had always respected these apex predators, but he'd never feared them. Today, however, a seed of doubt had taken root. He pulled out his waterproof notepad and jotted down the coordinates of the wreck one last time. The Midnight Star lay about 100 feet below the surface, well within his diving capabilities, but deep enough to demand caution. Mark had been planning this dive for weeks, poring over old maritime charts and piecing together the ship's history from local legends and official records. As he prepared to don his wetsuit, his satellite phone buzzed. It was his wife, Lisa. "Hey, honey," Mark answered, trying to keep his voice light. "I'm just about to head down." "Mark, are you sure about this?" Lisa's voice crackled with concern and poor reception. "The weather report doesn't look good, and you know how I feel about solo dives." Mark sighed, running a hand through his salt-stiffened hair. "I'll be fine, Lisa. I've done this 100 times. Besides, the wreck might not be in this condition for much longer. I need to document it while I can." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Just be careful, okay? Remember your promise." Mark's throat tightened. The promise to always come home no matter what. He'd made it years ago, after a close call during a cave diving expedition. "I remember," he said softly. "I love you. I'll call as soon as I'm back on the boat." After hanging up, Mark took a deep breath and began to suit up. The neoprene hugged his body, a second skin that would protect him from the ocean's chill. He strapped on his weight belt, checked his dive computer, and performed one last equipment test. Standing at the edge of the boat, mask in hand, Mark gazed out at the churning water. The wind had picked up, creating whitecaps that slapped against the hull. In the distance, dark clouds were gathering, hinting at the possibility of a storm. "Maybe Lisa's right," he murmured, doubt creeping into his thoughts. But the allure of the wreck, of being the first to thoroughly document its remains, was too strong to resist. Mark had always been drawn to the mysteries of the deep, and the Midnight Star represented the culmination of years of research and passion. With a final glance at the sky, Mark pulled on his mask, adjusted his regulator, and took the giant stride into the water. The initial shock of cold sent a jolt through his system, instantly sharpening his senses. He floated on the surface for a moment, performing a final check of his gear and getting his bearings. "You've got this," he reassured himself, his words muffled by the regulator. "Just stick to the plan." With a deep breath, Mark deflated his BCD and began his descent. The familiar pressure built in his ears as he sank deeper, equalizing every few feet. The surface light began to fade, the water around him darkening to a deep, rich blue. As he descended, Mark's apprehension began to give way to the familiar thrill of exploration. The underwater world had always been his sanctuary, a place where the troubles of the surface seemed to melt away. Here, suspended in the vast blue, he felt truly at peace. At around 50 feet, Mark paused to check his depth gauge and compass bearing. The water had become noticeably cooler, and visibility was less than ideal, perhaps 30 feet at most. He switched on his powerful dive light, its beam cutting through the murk like a knife. That's when he saw it, a massive, dark shape moving at the edge of his vision. Mark's heart rate spiked, his breath catching in his throat. He swung his light towards the movement, but whatever it was had vanished into the gloom. "Get a grip," he chided himself, forcing his breathing to slow. Probably just a big tuna or something. But as he resumed his descent, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The water around him seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, alive with hidden dangers. He found himself constantly swiveling his head, checking his surroundings with an almost paranoid intensity. At 80 feet, the first traces of the wreck came into view. A ghostly outline emerged from the darkness, the broken mast of the Midnight Star, reaching up from the depths like a skeletal finger. Mark felt a surge of excitement cut through his unease. This was what he had come for. As he approached the 100-foot mark, the full scale of the wreck became apparent. The Midnight Star lay on its starboard side, its hull encrusted with coral and teeming with fish. Schools of yellow tangs and butterfly fish darted in and out of rusted portholes, while larger predators, groupers and jacks lurked in the shadows. Mark hovered above the wreck, taking in the scene. Despite the poor visibility, it was a magnificent sight. He retrieved his underwater camera from its holster, eager to begin documenting his find. That's when he saw it again, the large shape, much clearer this time. It was unmistakably the silhouette of a shark, and a big one at that. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized what he was looking at. A tiger shark, at least 12 feet long, circling the perimeter of the wreck. For a moment, Mark was paralyzed with fear. Every instinct screamed at him to ascend, to get out of the water as fast as possible. But he knew that a rapid ascent from this depth could be just as deadly as any shark. "Stay calm," he whispered through his regulator, trying to slow his racing heart. "It's probably just curious. Don't act like prey." With deliberate, measured movements, Mark began to make his way towards the wreck. His plan had been to enter through a large gash in the hull, but now that seemed like a dangerously confining option. Instead, he decided to do a quick survey of the exterior before aborting the dive. As he moved along the ship's barnacle-encrusted flank, Mark kept one eye on his surroundings and one on the shark. The massive predator seemed content to maintain its distance for now, but its presence was a constant, terrifying reminder of the ocean's dangers. Mark managed to snap a few photos, his hands shaking slightly as he operated the camera. The wreck was everything he had hoped for, a time capsule of maritime history. Under different circumstances, he would have been elated. He had just reached the ship's stern when his dive computer beeped, warning him that he was nearing the limits of his bottom time. Mark knew he should start his ascent, but something caught his eye, a glint of metal near the ship's propeller. Just a quick nook, he thought, swimming closer to investigate. It was a rookie mistake. As Mark approached the propeller, he failed to notice how the shark had changed its pattern, swimming closer with each pass. By the time he realized the danger, it was almost too late. The tiger shark charged, its powerful body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Mark barely had time to react, instinctively kicking away from the wreck. He felt the rush of water as the shark passed by, missing him by inches. His heart pounding, Mark began to ascend, keeping his eyes locked on the circling predator. The shark's behavior had changed. It was no longer merely curious. Mark had accidentally entered its hunting grounds, and now he was being viewed as potential prey. As he rose through the water column, fighting the urge to rocket to the surface, Mark's mind raced. He was still too deep for a safe ascent, but the shark was circling back, its intentions clear in the cold, black eyes. With growing horror, Mark realized his mistake. In his haste to explore the wreck, he had ignored the warning signs, the poor conditions, his own unease, and the presence of the shark. Now, trapped between the crushing depths and a hunter perfectly evolved for killing, he faced the fight of his life. The chapter ends with Mark at 70 feet, the shark circling below, and the surface still agonizingly far away. As he prepares for another charge, one thought echoes in his mind: the promise he made to Lisa, to always come home. With grim determination, Mark readies himself for the battle ahead, knowing that his survival will depend on every ounce of skill, luck, and courage he can muster. Mark's heart pounded in his ears as he hovered at 70 feet, his eyes darting between the circling shark below and the distant shimmer of the surface above. The tiger shark's massive form cut through the murky water with effortless grace, its black eyes fixed on Mark with predatory intent. "Stay calm," Mark muttered through his regulator, his voice a trembling whisper. "Think, damn it, think." He knew he couldn't outswim the shark, not in open water. His only chance was to find shelter, to put something solid between himself and those rows of serrated teeth. With a jolt of clarity, Mark realized his best option lay in the very place he'd been trying to escape, the wreck of the Midnight Star. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Mark began a controlled descent back towards the ship. Every fiber of his being screamed to swim up, to make a mad dash for the surface, but he forced himself to move slowly. Any sudden movements might trigger the shark's predatory instincts. As he neared the wreck, Mark could see the gash in the hull he'd noticed earlier. It was his best chance, a tight space where the shark couldn't follow. He angled towards it, keeping one eye on the predator that now seemed to be rising to meet him. Just as Mark reached the opening, the shark made its move. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it charged straight for him. Mark's survival instincts took over. He tucked and rolled, squeezing through the jagged tear in the metal. He felt a rush of water behind him as the shark's massive body slammed into the hull, missing him by mere inches. Inside the wreck, darkness enveloped Mark. His breathing was rapid and shallow, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He fumbled for his dive light, his hands shaking as he switched it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the eerie interior of the long-sunken ship. "Get it together, Chen," he chastised himself, forcing his breathing to slow. "You're not dead yet." Mark swept his light around, taking in his surroundings. He was in what appeared to be a cargo hold, long empty save for the remnants of wooden crates now serving as artificial reefs. Schools of small fish darted away from his light, seeking shelter in the shadows. A loud thump from outside made Mark flinch. The shark was still there, circling the wreck, searching for a way in. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. His air supply was limited, and he still needed to make a safe ascent. But for now, at least, he was out of immediate danger. Mark began to move deeper into the ship, his light illuminating corridors choked with silt and overgrown with coral. He tried to focus on his training, on the procedures for navigating a wreck dive. But the knowledge that a hungry predator waited just outside made it hard to concentrate. As he swam through a narrow passageway, something caught Mark's eye, a glint of metal out of place among the organic growth. He moved closer, brushing away a layer of silt to reveal a brass plaque still affixed to the wall. "Captain's quarters," Mark read aloud, his voice muffled by his regulator. A surge of excitement momentarily overshadowed his fear. The captain's quarters could contain valuable artifacts, perhaps even clues to why the Midnight Star had sunk. Despite his precarious situation, the explorer in Mark couldn't resist the lure of discovery. He carefully maneuvered through the doorway, mindful of his equipment in the tight space. The room beyond was small but well preserved, and desk, bolted to the floor, still stood upright. Shelves lined the walls, their contents long since carried away by currents or looters. Mark's light fell on something that made his breath catch. A safe, partially hidden behind a fallen bookcase. It was old and corroded, but the door hung slightly ajar. "No way," Mark whispered, excitement building. This could be the find of a lifetime. He swam closer, reaching out to pull the safe door open. As his fingers touched the cold metal, a violent impact rocked the entire ship. Mark was thrown against the wall, his tank clanging loudly in the confined space. Outside, the tiger shark had rammed the wreck again, with even greater force than before. The ancient metal groaned under the assault, and Mark watched in horror as a shower of rust and debris floated down from the ceiling. Sit, he cursed, realizing his mistake. In his excitement over the potential discovery, he'd let his guard down. Now, the shark's attacks threatened to destabilize the entire wreck. Another impact sent tremors through the ship. Mark knew he had to move. The captain's quarters were too confined, too dangerous if the structure began to collapse. He needed to find a more secure position, preferably with a clear path to the exit. As he turned to leave, his light caught something inside the safe, a glint of gold. Mark hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the temptation of uncovering the ship's secrets. In that moment of indecision, fate made the choice for him. A third, massive impact hit the ship. This time, Mark heard the screech of tearing metal. A section of the ceiling gave way, sending a cascade of debris down upon him. He raised his arms instinctively, but not quickly enough. A piece of metal struck his mask, knocking it askew. Cold seawater rushed in, filling Mark's nose and mouth. He coughed and sputtered, fighting down the surge of panic as he struggled to clear his mask. In his thrashing, he knocked his dive light against the desk. The impact caused it to flicker and die, plunging him into total darkness. For a terrifying moment, Mark was lost in a world of black water and confusion. He could taste blood in his mouth, whether from biting his tongue or a cut from the debris. He couldn't tell. His lungs burned for air, and the overwhelming urge to rip out his regulator and gasp for breath was almost unbearable. Lo! Mark's mind screamed, fighting against the panic. Focus! With trembling hands, he found his regulator and purged it, then took several deep breaths. The rush of air helped clear his hand. Next, he reached for his mask, adjusting it back into place and performing a quick clear. As his situational awareness returned, Mark realized he was in serious trouble. He was trapped in a damaged section of the wreck, in complete darkness, with a relentless predator circling outside. His primary light was dead, and he couldn't be certain of the structural integrity of his surroundings. Mark fumbled for his backup light, a small, less powerful torch attached to his BCD. It took several agonizing seconds to find it in the dark, each moment expecting another impact from the shark. When he finally switched it on, the weak beam seemed pitiful compared to the darkness pressing in around him. "Okay, Mark," he said to himself, trying to keep his voice steady. "One problem at a time. Find a way out. Deal with the shark later." He began to move cautiously through the wreck, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the water around him. The passages seemed different in the dim light of his backup torch. Familiar landmarks twisted into unrecognizable shapes. As he rounded a corner, Mark's light fell upon a sight that made his blood run cold. Ahead of him, where there should have been open passage, was a wall of twisted metal and debris. The shark's attacks had caused a partial collapse, blocking his planned exit route. No, Mark muttered, the first tendrils of true despair creeping into his voice. He was running out of options, and more importantly, he was running out of air. A quick glance at his gauge showed his tank was down to a third, not nearly enough for prolonged problem-solving. Just then, a movement caught Mark's eye. Through a small gap in the debris, he saw a large shape pass by the shark, still patrolling the exterior of the wreck. But in that brief moment, Mark also saw something else. A faint glimmer of blue, open water. Beyond the debris lay his path to freedom. With renewed determination, Mark began to assess the blockage. Most of the debris was too heavy to move, but he spotted a section that looked less stable. If he could shift just a few key pieces, he might be able to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. Time seemed to slow as Mark worked, every second marked by the steady decrease of air in his tank. He pushed and pulled at the debris, ignoring the scrapes and cuts on his hands. Little by little, an opening began to form. Just as Mark thought he might have a chance, he heard the sound of rushing water, growing louder by the second. His efforts had destabilized the debris field, and now seawater was pouring in through the gaps he'd created. The sudden influx of water created a powerful current, tugging at Mark's body. He clung to a piece of wreckage, fighting against the pull. But even as he struggled, he realized this might be his only chance. The current was widening the opening. If he timed it right, he could use the flow to propel himself through. It was a desperate gamble, but Mark was out of options. Taking one last deep breath, he let go of his handhold and allowed the current to take him. The rushing water pulled him towards the opening, debris scraping against his wetsuit as he was sucked through the gap. For a heart-stopping moment, Mark thought he was stuck. Then, with a final surge, he burst free of the wreck and into open water. The relief was short-lived, however, as he came face to face with the tiger shark, hovering mere feet away. Its black eyes locked on him with predatory focus. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, Mark finds himself in a harrowing standoff. Behind him lies the damaged wreck of the Midnight Star, no longer a refuge but a death trap. Before him, the tiger shark circles slowly, its intentions clear. With his air supply dwindling and his strength waning, Mark knows the real battle for survival is only just beginning. Mark's heart raced as he hovered in the open water, face to face with the tiger shark. The predator's massive form glided in a lazy circle, its black eyes never leaving Mark's behavior. Tiger sharks were known for their curiosity and their willingness to test potential prey. He needed to convince this one that he wasn't worth the effort. Slowly, carefully, Mark began to turn, keeping the shark in his field of vision. His back was to the wreck now, and he could feel the gentle current created by the water flowing through the hole he'd escaped from. An idea began to form in his mind, risky, but potentially life-saving. "Okay, big guy," Mark murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. "Let's see how you like this." With deliberate movements, Mark reached for his dive knife, strapped to his leg. The shark's eyes seemed to focus on the glint of metal as he unsheathed it. Mark's plan was simple, born of desperation and adrenaline. Use the knife to create a distraction, then make a break for a safer part of the wreck. Just as he was about to put his plan into action, a loud metallic groan emanated from the Midnight Star. The damage caused by the shark's earlier attacks and Mark's escape had destabilized part of the structure. Mark watched in horror as a large section of the hull began to shift, sending up a cloud of silt and debris. The sudden movement and noise startled the shark. It darted forward, mouth agape, more out of reflex than a dedicated attack. Mark reacted on pure instinct, bringing up his knife in a defensive arc. The blade caught the shark's snout, opening a shallow cut. The predator recoiled, more surprised than hurt. But the moment of confusion was all Mark needed. He kicked hard, propelling himself towards a different opening in the wreck's hull, one he'd noticed during his earlier exploration. Water rushed past Mark's ears as he swam with every ounce of strength he possessed. He could feel the shark's presence behind him, knew it was giving chase. The opening loomed ahead, a dark maw in the rusted metal. It was tight, possibly too tight for the shark to follow, but also dangerously constrictive for a panicked diver. Mark reached the opening and squeezed through, feeling his tank scrape against the jagged edges. For one heart-stopping moment, he thought he was stuck. Then, with a final desperate push, he burst through into the interior of the ship. Panting heavily, Mark spun around, half expecting to see the shark's teeth closing in on him. Instead, he saw the predator circling outside, its outline visible through the opening. It was too large to follow, but Mark knew it wouldn't give up easily. He was safe for the moment, but far from out of danger. "Jesus Christ," Mark gasped, allowing himself a moment to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, adrenaline coursing through his veins. A quick check of his air gauge sent another jolt of fear through him. He was down to a quarter tank. Not nearly enough for a safe ascent from this depth, especially with a hostile shark patrolling the area. Mark forced himself to focus, to push down the panic threatening to overwhelm him. He swept his backup light around, trying to get his bearings. He was in a different part of the ship now, what looked like it might have been a dining area. Tables bolted to the floor were now sideways, creating an alien landscape of metal and coral. As his light played over the room, something caught Mark's eye. A glint of metal out of place among the organic growth. He swam closer, curious despite his precarious situation. It was a door half hidden behind a fallen beam. The metal was corroded, but Mark could make out lettering etched into its surface. Storage. Well, Mark murmured, his explorer's instincts momentarily overriding his fear. What have we here? He knew he should be focusing on finding a way out, on conserving his remaining air. But the prospect of uncovering the Midnight Star's secrets was too tempting to resist. Besides, he rationalized, he needed a safe place to plan his next move. The storage room might provide both shelter and answers. With effort, Mark managed to shift the beam enough to access the door. It was jammed, years of sediment and rust sealing it shut. He braced himself against a nearby table and pulled with all his might. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire ship, the door creaked open. Mark's light revealed a room packed with crates and barrels, their contents a mystery lost to time and the sea. He swam inside, his curiosity growing with each passing second. This was the kind of discovery he lived for, the reason he'd risked so much to explore the Midnight Star. As he moved deeper into the storage room, Mark's light fell upon a peculiar crate, different from the others. It was smaller, made of a dark wood that had somehow resisted the ocean's decay. A heavy padlock, now broken by time and pressure, hung from its latch. Now what were you protecting? Mark wondered aloud, reaching for the crate. Just as his fingers touched the weathered wood, a violent tremor shook the ship. Mark was thrown against a stack of barrels, his tank clanging loudly in the confined space. Outside, he heard the unmistakable sound of tearing metal. The shark had resumed its attack on the wreck, with even greater ferocity than before. Mark realized with growing horror that his escape into the ship had only made the predator more determined. It was using its powerful body to try and break through the weakened hull. Another impact rocked the storage room. Mark watched in dismay as cracks began to form in the walls, small jets of water spraying through. The Midnight Star, after decades of silent endurance, was finally succumbing to the relentless assault. No, Mark muttered, his voice rising with panic. He was trapped in a rapidly deteriorating metal coffin, with a relentless predator outside and dwindling air in his tank. The full weight of his situation came crashing down on him, threatening to paralyze him with fear. A particularly violent impact sent a shower of debris raining down. Mark instinctively covered his head, feeling pieces of metal and would bounce off his wetsuit. When he looked up, his blood ran cold. A large crack had formed in the ceiling, water pouring through in a steady stream. Mark knew he had only moments before the room flooded completely. His eyes darted around, searching desperately for an escape route. The door he'd entered through was now blocked by fallen debris. The cracks in the walls were too small for him to squeeze through, even if he ditched his gear. Just as despair began to set in, Mark's light fell upon something he'd missed before, a small hatch in the floor, partially hidden beneath the fallen crate. It was a long shot, but it might lead to a different part of the ship, one that wasn't compromised. With strength born of desperation, Mark heaved the crate aside. The hatch was rusted shut, but the alternative was certain death. He pounded on it with his dive knife, ignoring the pain that shot through his hand with each impact. Water was pouring in faster now, already up to Mark's waist as he knelt by the hatch. He could hear the groan of stressed metal all around him, knew that the room could implode at any moment from the pressure differential. Come on. Mark growls, slamming his knife into the hatch's hinges. With a sudden give, the hatch sprung open. Mark had no time to celebrate his small victory. He took a deep breath and plunged into the dark opening, not knowing what awaited him below. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for Mark to squeeze through with his gear. He descended blindly, one hand trailing along the wall to guide him. His air was dangerously low now, the exertion of the past few minutes having drained his tank faster than he'd anticipated. Just as Mark's lungs began to burn, demanding air, his feet hit solid ground. He had reached the bottom of the passage. Frantically, he swept his light around, praying for a way out. There, another opening, this one leading into what looked like the ship's engine room. Mark swam towards it, his movements sluggish from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. As he entered the larger space, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Surely there would be a way out from here, a path back to open water and the surface above. But as Mark's light illuminated the engine room, that hope turned to ash. The far wall, where he had expected to find an exit, was completely caved in. Twisted metal and debris formed an impenetrable barrier between him and freedom. Mark's vision began to darken at the edges, his body screaming for air. With the last of his strength, he swam upwards, searching for any pocket of air that might have been trapped in the ceiling. There was nothing, just unyielding metal and the cold, dark water that had claimed the Midnight Star decades ago, and was now poised to claim him as well. As Chapter 3 comes to a close, Mark Chen finds himself in the most dire situation yet. Trapped in the bowels of a disintegrating shipwreck, his air supply all but exhausted, and a relentless predator still circling outside. The chapter ends with Mark facing the very real possibility that the Midnight Star may become his final resting place. The secrets he sought to uncover dying with him in the depths of the Pacific. Mark's lungs burned, screaming for air as he frantically searched the engine room for any sign of escape. His vision was narrowing, dark spots dancing at the edges. With each passing second, the weight of the ocean seemed to press in harder, as if eager to claim him. Sink! Damn it! He mentally berated himself, fighting against the creeping panic. There's always a way out. Always. His light swept across the cluttered room, illuminating rusted machinery and tangled cables. Everything was covered in a thick layer of silt, disturbed now by Mark's desperate movements. As his beam passed over a far corner, something caught his eye, a slightly different shade of metal, a shape that didn't quite fit with the rest of the debris. With the last reserves of his strength, Mark kicked towards it. As he drew closer, his heart leaped. It was a maintenance hatch, small and almost hidden behind a fallen pipe. "Trees," he whispered through his regulator. "Please be open." Mark reached the hatch, his fingers scrabbling at its edges. It was stuck, years of corrosion sealing it shut. He pulled with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. Black spots were expanding in his vision now, his body on the verge of involuntarily gasping for air that wasn't there. In a last, desperate move, Mark unsheathed his dive knife. He wedged it into the gap around the hatch and used it as a lever, putting his whole weight behind it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of protesting metal that seemed to vibrate through the entire ship, the hatch gave way. Water rushed through the opening, pulling Mark with it. He tumbled through, barely conscious, into a narrow maintenance shaft. The force of the water propelled him upward, and suddenly, miraculously, his head broke the surface. Mark tore off his regulator, gasping and coughing as he gulped down air. The shaft was only partially flooded, trapping a pocket of air at the top. It was stale and humid, but to Mark's oxygen-starved lungs, it was sweeter than anything he'd ever tasted. "Oh God," he panted. "Oh, thank God." For a few moments, Mark simply floated there, breathing deeply and allowing the fog of near unconsciousness to clear from his mind. As his senses returned, he took stock of his situation. He was alive, which was more than he'd dared hope for a minute ago, but he was far from safe. The maintenance shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for Mark to turn around in with his scuba gear on. His light revealed that it extended upwards for some distance before taking a horizontal turn. There was no way to tell where it led or if it offered a path out of the wreck. A sudden vibration through the metal around him served as a stark reminder. The shark was still out there, still attacking the ship, and the Midnight Star, already weakened by decades under the sea, couldn't withstand the assault forever. "Okay, Mark," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "One problem at a time. Air first." He checked his gauge and felt his heart sink. The tank was almost empty. He had maybe 5 minutes of air left, not nearly enough for a safe ascent even if he found a way out right now. Mark unclipped the tank from his BCD and maneuvered it in front of him. With practiced movements, he purged the remaining air into the pocket at the top of the shaft. It wasn't much, but it might buy him a few extra minutes to think. As he worked, Mark's mind raced through his options. He could try to follow the shaft and hope it led to an exit, but if it was a dead end, he'd have wasted precious time in air. He could attempt to swim back through the flooded sections of the ship, searching for the hole he'd originally entered through. But without a clear pass, he'd likely get lost in the labyrinth of the wreck. A particularly violent impact shook the ship, sending a shower of rust and debris raining down on Mark. He could hear the groan of stressed metal all around him, knew that the Midnight Star was reaching its breaking point. "All right," Mark muttered, making his decision. "Up we go. Has to lead somewhere." He began to ascend the shaft, using the walls to pull himself up through the water. It was slow going. The confined space made it difficult to maneuver, and every few feet Mark had to stop and take a breath from the pocket of air he'd created. As he climbed, Mark's mind wandered to Lisa, to the promise he'd made her. "I'm trying, honey," he whispered. "I'm not giving up." After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Mark reached the point where the shaft turned horizontal. He paused, taking a few deep breaths. The air pocket hadn't followed him up, and he knew his next breath would have to come from his nearly empty tank. "Here goes nothing," Mark said, and pushed forward into the horizontal section. The shaft seemed to go on forever, a claustrophobic tunnel of corroded metal. Mark's progress was agonizingly slow, every movement a struggle against the water and his own exhaustion. His lungs began to burn again, demanding air. Just as Mark was about to turn back, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake, his light fell upon something ahead, a grate, covering the end of the shaft. Beyond it, he could see open water. A surge of hope gave Mark a fresh burst of energy. He swam faster, reaching the grate in seconds. It was covered in growth, but he could see that the metal was weakened by years of corrosion. Mark braced himself against the sides of the shaft and kicked at the grate with both feet. Once, twice, 3 times he kicked. On the 4th try, he felt something give. With a crack that seemed deafening in the enclosed space, the grate broke free. It tumbled away into open water, leaving Mark's path clear. Without hesitation, Mark shot through the opening. He emerged into the open ocean, his heart soaring at the sight of blue water all around him. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of triumph. That triumph was short-lived. As Mark oriented himself, ready to begin his ascent, a dark shape moved in his peripheral vision. The tiger shark, drawn by his sudden emergence from the wreck, was charging straight for him. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw the shark's black eye, filled with primal hunger. He saw the rows of serrated teeth as its mouth began to open. In that moment, Mark knew with terrible certainty that he was about to die. But some deep, primal part of Mark's brain refused to accept that fate. Acting on pure instinct, he twisted in the water, bringing up his dive knife. As the shark's jaws were about to close on him, Mark drove the knife deep into the predator's snout. The shark recoiled, more from surprise than pain, and veered off course, giving Mark the opening he desperately needed. He kicked hard, propelling himself upward towards the distant surface. Mark's lungs were on fire, his muscles screaming in protest. He'd used the last of his air escaping the wreck, and now he was racing against his body's desperate need for oxygen. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a shimmering barrier between life and death. Behind him, Mark could sense the shark recovering, knew it would be coming for him again, but he couldn't spare the energy to look back. Every ounce of his being was focused on that patch of light above, growing slowly larger as he ascended. Spots danced in Mark's vision. His limbs felt leaden, each kick weaker than the last. Part of him wanted to give in, to simply stop fighting and let the ocean take him. But Elisa's face flashed in his mind, and with it came a surge of determination. He had promised to come home. With one final Herculean effort, Mark clawed his way towards the light. His head broke the surface, and he gasped, drawing in great lungfuls of air. He coughed and sputtered, the taste of salt sharp on his tongue, but it was the sweetest thing he'd ever experienced. For a few moments, Mark simply floated there, breathing deeply and allowing relief to wash over him. He'd made it. Against all odds, he'd escaped the midnight star and cheated death. But as his senses returned, Mark realized his ordeal wasn't over. He was still miles from shore, floating in shark-infested waters. His boat was nowhere in sight, likely driven off by the worsening weather. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, promising a storm. As if to underscore the danger, Mark felt something brush against his leg beneath the water. The shark was still there, circling, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Mark knew he couldn't stay where he was. With tired arms, he began to swim, picking a direction he hoped would lead him to shore or into the path of a passing boat. Each stroke was a battle against exhaustion, each moment filled with the terrifying knowledge that death still lurked just beneath the surface. As Chapter 4 draws to a close, Mark Chen finds himself in a new kind of peril. He's escaped the clutches of the midnight star, cheated death in the depths, but now faces the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open ocean. With a determined predator still on his trail and a storm brewing on the horizon, Mark's fight for survival is far from over. The chapter ends with him stroking steadily through the choppy water, his eyes scanning desperately for any sign of rescue. While beneath the waves, a dark shape continues its relentless pursuit. Mark's arms burned as he pushed through the choppy waves, each stroke of battle against exhaustion and the growing swells. The storm on the horizon was moving in faster than he'd anticipated, turning the once calm Pacific into a roiling mass of gray-blue anger. "Keep moving," he gasped to himself, spitting out a mouthful of salt water. Just keep moving. But even as he urged himself on, Mark knew he was fighting a losing battle. He'd been swimming for what felt like hours, though in reality it had likely been less than one. His muscles screamed for rest, and the adrenaline that had fueled his escape from the midnight star was long since spent. Worst of all, he could sense the shark's presence. Every few minutes, he'd catch a glimpse of a dark shape moving beneath the surface, circling ever closer. The tiger shark was patient, conserving its energy as it waited for Mark to weaken. A particularly large wave crashed over Mark's head, sending him tumbling beneath the surface. For a moment, panic gripped him as he struggled to right himself. As he broke the surface again, gasping for air, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The shark was charging straight for him, its dorsal fin cutting through the water. Or like a knife. "No!" Mark shouted, more in defiance than fear. He took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface, hoping to throw off the predator's attack. Underwater, the world became a blur of bubbles and murky blue. Mark could see the shark clearly now, its massive form speeding towards him with deadly intent. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Mark saw the shark's black eye, filled with primal hunger. He saw the rows of serrated teeth as its mouth began to open. With a desperate kick, Mark propelled himself to the side, feeling the rush of water as the shark shot past him. Its rough skin grazed his leg, leaving a trail of stinging cuts. Mark surfaced, gulping air and spinning around wildly, trying to locate the shark. He knew it would be coming back for another pass. "Come on," he muttered, his eyes scanning the choppy water. "Where are you, you bastard?" As if in answer, the water behind Mark erupted. The shark lunged halfway out of the sea, its jaws snapping shut mere inches from Mark's foot as he kicked away. Panic gave Mark a fresh burst of energy. He swam hard, not caring about direction or conservation of energy. All that mattered was putting distance between himself and those terrifying jaws. But the shark was relentless. It circled and charged again and again, each attack coming closer than the last. Mark was tiring quickly, his movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. Just as he felt his strength beginning to fail, Mark's hand struck something solid. Blinking salt water from his eyes, he realized he'd swum into a cluster of floating debris, pieces of wood and plastic carried by the currents. An idea formed in Mark's exhausted mind. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was all he had. Grabbing a long piece of wood that might have once been part of a shipping pallet, Mark turned to face the approaching shark. He could see its dorsal fins slicing through the water, heading straight for him. "All right, you son of a bitch," Mark growls, tightening his grip on the makeshift weapon. "Let's dance." As the shark closed in, Mark took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface. He could see the predator clearly now, its mouth opening wide as it prepared to strike. At the last possible moment, Mark thrust the piece of wood forward. Whether by skill or sheer luck, it wedged itself vertically in the shark's mouth, propping its jaws open. The shark thrashed violently, confused and enraged by the obstruction. Its powerful tail sent it veering off course, giving Mark the opening he needed. He kicked hard, propelling himself back to the surface and away from the frenzied predator. Gasping for air, Mark allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He'd bought himself some time, but he was under no illusions. The shark would be back, angrier than ever. As if to emphasize the point, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. The storm was nearly upon him now, the swells growing larger with each passing minute. "Out of the frying pan," Mark muttered, eyeing the darkening horizon. He knew he needed to find something more substantial to cling to if he was going to survive the coming storm. Scanning the area, Mark spotted a larger piece of debris a short distance away. It looked like part of a broken surfboard, its bright yellow color a beacon of hope in the gray seascape. With the last reserves of his strength, Mark swam towards it. Each stroke was agony, his muscles pushed well beyond their limits. But the alternative, giving up and slipping beneath the waves, was unthinkable. Just as Mark's fingers closed around the edge of the surfboard fragment, he felt something brush against his leg. His heart leaped into his throat as he realized the shark had returned. With a desperate heave, Mark pulled himself onto the piece of surfboard. It was barely large enough to support him, but it kept most of his body out of the water. He clung to it, panting heavily, as rain began to pelt down from the angry sky. Through the curtain of rain, Mark saw the shark's fin circling. It was closer now, emboldened by his weakened state. He knew the fragile piece of surfboard wouldn't offer much protection if the predator decided to attack in earnest. As if reading his thoughts, the shark suddenly changed course, heading straight for him. Mark could see its dark shape beneath the water, growing larger as it approached. "No, no, no," Mark chanted, his voice rising with panic. He kicked frantically, trying to maneuver the surfboard fragment, but it was too unwieldy. The shark slammed into the board, nearly capsizing it. Mark held on for dear life, feeling the predator's rough skin scrape against his legs as it passed beneath him. For the next several minutes, the shark continued its assault. Each attack sent Mark's heart racing, certain that this would be the one that finally knocked him into the water. But somehow, miraculously, he managed to hold on. As suddenly as it had begun, the attack ceased. The shark's fin disappeared beneath the waves, leaving Mark alone in the storm-tossed sea. But Mark knew better than to feel relief. This was just another tactic. The shark was adapting, conserving its energy as it waited for him to slip up. The storm was in full force now. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening cracks of thunder. The rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Waves crashed over Mark, threatening to tear him from his tenuous perch on the surfboard fragment. As he clung to the board, fighting to keep his head above water, Mark's thoughts turned to Lisa. He imagined her at home, perhaps looking out at the storm and worrying about him. The image brought a lump to his throat. "I'm sorry, Lisa," he whispered, his words lost in the howling wind. "I'm so sorry." A particularly large wave lifted Mark high into the air before sending him crashing back down. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a moment, he lost his grip on the board. Mark flailed in the water, panic giving him strength he didn't know he still possessed. His hand found the edge of the board, and he pulled himself back on with a desperate heave. As he lay there, gasping and shivering, Mark became aware of a new sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but as he listened harder, his heart leaped. It was the sound of a helicopter. Mark raised his head, squinting through the rain. There, barely visible through the gloom, was a search and rescue chopper. Its spotlight swept back and forth across the churning sea. "Here!" Mark screamed, waving his arms frantically. "I'm here!" But his voice was lost in the storm, and the helicopter's spotlight passed over him without pausing. Mark watched in despair as it began to turn away. In that moment of distraction, Mark felt something bump against the surfboard. He looked down to see the shark's fin cutting through the water, circling closer. The predator had sensed his moment of weakness and was moving in for the kill. As Chapter 5 draws to a close, Mark finds himself caught in a perfect storm of danger. The rescue he so desperately needs is slipping away, while beneath the waves, a relentless hunter prepares for its final attack. Battered by the elements and pushed to the very limits of human endurance, Mark faces a terrible choice: risk everything on a desperate bid for rescue, or cling to his fragile sanctuary and face the shark's inevitable assault. The chapter ends with Mark poised on the knife's edge between life and death, the storm raging around him, as he prepares to make a decision that will determine whether he lives to see another day. The helicopter's rotor blades chopped through the rain-soaked air, its sound a tantalizing promise of salvation that was rapidly fading. Mark Chun, clinging desperately to his makeshift float, faced an impossible decision. The shark circled ever closer, its dark fins slicing through the turbulent water with deadly purpose. Every instinct screamed at him to stay on the relative safety of the surfboard fragment, but Mark knew that if he didn't act now, his one chance at rescue would disappear into the storm. "Come on, Mark," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Make a choice. Live or die." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark relief. In that brief, electric moment, Mark saw the full horror of his situation. The shark was massive, far larger than he'd initially realized. Its scarred hide spoke of years of battles won, of a predator at the apex of its game. And now it had Mark firmly in its sights. The spotlight from the helicopter swept past again, achingly close but still oblivious to his presence. It was now or never. With a deep breath that could very well be his last, Mark made his choice. He pushed off from the surfboard, plunging into the churning sea. The shock of the cold water drove the air from his lungs, but adrenaline propelled him forward. He swam with every ounce of strength left in his battered body, one arm raised high above the waves. "Hey!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and barely audible above the storm. "Over here! Help!" For a heart-stopping moment, nothing changed. The helicopter continued its arc away from him, the sound of its engines beginning to fade. Despair threatened to overwhelm Mark, but he fought it back. He hadn't come this far, survived so much, to give up now. Treading water, Mark fumbled at his belt for his dive knife. It was the only tool he had left, his last desperate hope. With shaking hands, he unsheathed the blade and held it up, angling it towards the helicopter's spotlight. A flash of reflected light cut through the gloom. Then another. Mark's heart leaped as he saw the helicopter begin to bank, turning back towards his position. But his elation was short-lived. A surge of water behind him signaled the shark's approach. Mark spun in the water, coming face to face with the predator's open maw. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw every detail with terrifying clarity: the rows of serrated teeth, the black, soulless eye rolling back in its head as it prepared to strike. In that moment, Mark was certain he was about to die. Then instinct took over. As the shark lunged, Mark dove beneath the surface. He felt the rush of water as the massive body passed over him, close enough that its rough skin scraped against his back. Underwater, the world became a chaos of bubbles and murky shapes. Mark kicked hard, trying to put distance between himself and the shark. His lungs burned, desperate for air. But he knew surfacing too soon would mean certain death. Just as his body screamed for oxygen, Mark felt something grip his arm. Panic surged through him, certain the shark had returned. He thrashed wildly, swinging his knife in a blind arc. "Easy, easy," a voice shouted, barely audible over the storm. "I've got you." Mark's head broke the surface, and he gasped in great lungfuls of air. Through the rain and spray, he saw a figure in a bright orange wetsuit, a rescue swimmer from the helicopter. "Hold on," the swimmer yelled, securing a harness around Mark's chest. "We're going up." As they were winched towards the hovering helicopter, Mark looked down. The shark was still there, circling in frustrated rage as its prey was lifted beyond its reach. For a moment, their eyes met, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Then the creature turned and vanished into the depths. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Hands reached down, pulling Mark into the helicopter's cabin. Voices shouted over the roar of the engines, but the words were indistinct, meaningless. All Mark could focus on was the simple, miraculous fact that he was alive. As the helicopter banked, heading for shore, the adrenaline that had kept Mark going began to ebb. The full weight of his ordeal crashed down upon him. Every muscle in his body ached, and he began to shake uncontrollably, a combination of cold and delayed shock. A paramedic wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders, shouting questions that Mark could barely process. He caught fragments. "How long in the water? Any injuries? Sir, can you hear me?" Mark tried to respond, but his teeth were chattering too hard to form words. He settled for a nod, hoping it would suffice. As the paramedic worked, checking his vitals and starting in 4, Mark's gaze drifted to the helicopter's window. The storm was beginning to clear, the angry gray clouds giving way to patches of blue sky. In the distance, he could see the coastline of Oahu, a strip of green and gold that had never looked more beautiful. "Sir," the paramedic's voice cut through Mark's daze. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Mark swallowed hard, finding his voice at last. Mark," he managed. "Mark Chen." The paramedic nodded, jotting something on a clipboard. "Okay, Mark, they're doing great. We're going to get you to the hospital soon. Can you tell me what happened out there?" The question brought a flood of memories: the wreck of the Midnight Star, the terrifying moments trapped inside, the relentless pursuit of the shark. Mark shuddered, closing his eyes against the onslaught of images. "Tiger shark," he stammered. "Big one. It wouldn't stop coming." The paramedic's eyebrows rose. "A tiger shark? Out here?" He exchanged a glance with his colleague. "That's rare. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Chun." "Mati." The word echoed in Mark's mind. Was it luck that had saved him, or something else? He thought of Lisa, of the promise he'd made to always come home. Had that been what kept him fighting when all hope seemed lost? As if summoned by his thoughts, the radio crackled to life. "Coast Guard rescue to base. We have the diver." Repeat, "We have the diver." Mark Chen, age 42, conscious and stable. ETA to Honolulu General, 10 minutes. A voice responded, thick with emotion. "Base to rescue. Understood. Please tell him Lisa is waiting." Mark's heart clenched. Misa. She must have been out of her mind with worry. How long had he been missing? Hours? A day? "Lisa," he whispered. his voice catching. "I need to talk to Lisa." The paramedic nodded sympathetically. "Soon, Mr. Chun. As soon as we land, I promise." The rest of the flight passed in a haze of exhaustion and pain. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind replaying fragments of his ordeal. The dark confines of the Midnight Star, the heart-stopping moment when the shark first appeared, the desperation of clinging to a piece of debris in the middle of a storm-tossed ocean. But through it all, one thought remained constant. He had survived. Against all odds, he had kept his promise to Lisa. The helicopter touched down on the roof of Honolulu General with a gentle thud. As the doors slid open, Mark was assaulted by a cacophony of sounds and a flurry of activity. Medical personnel swarmed around him, transferring him to a gurney with practiced efficiency. As they wheeled him towards the elevator, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Mark! Oh my God, Mark!" Lisa pushed through the crowd, her face pale and tear-streaked. When she reached the gurney, she grasped Mark's hand, holding it as if she'd never let go. "Lisa?" Mark croaked, feeling tears spring to his own eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She shook her head, pressing a kiss to his salt-crusted forehead. "Don't you dare apologize. You're alive. That's all that matters." As they descended in the elevator, Lisa never let go of Mark's hand. She peppered the medical staff with questions, her journalist's instincts kicking in despite her emotional state. "How is he? What are his injuries? When can I take him home?" A doctor, her face kind but serious, addressed Lisa's concerns. "Mr. Chan is suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. He has multiple lacerations, likely from contact with the shark, but miraculously no major injuries. We'll need to keep him for observation for at least 24 hours, possibly longer." Lisa nodded, squeezing Mark's hand. "You hear that, honey? You're going to be okay." Mark managed a weak smile. "Told you I'd come home." As they reached the emergency department, the reality of Mark's narrow escape began to sink in. Nurses bustled around him, attaching monitors and changing his IV. A police officer hovered nearby, waiting to take a statement about the incident. But all Mark could focus on was Lisa's presence. She was his anchor, his reminder that he had something to live for beyond the next breath, the next wave. As the adrenaline of survival faded, exhaustion took hold. Mark's eyelids grew heavy, the voices around him becoming distant and muffled. But before he succumbed to sleep, he tightened his grip on Lisa's hand. "Lisa," he murmured, "I saw something down there, in the wreck. Something important." Lisa leaned in, her brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean? What did you see?" But Mark's eyes were already closing, his body demanding the rest it so desperately needed. As he drifted off, the image that had been nagging at the back of his mind came into sharp focus. The small, ornate box he glimpsed in the captain's quarters of the Midnight Star, just before everything went to hell. In his last moments of consciousness, Mark made a silent vow. He would recover, regain his strength, and then, somehow, he would find a way back to the Midnight Star. Because whatever secret that box held, Mark knew it was worth risking everything to uncover. As Chapter 6 draws to a close, Mark Chun lies in a hospital bed, battered but alive. The immediate danger has passed, but the echoes of his ordeal linger. The chapter ends with the seeds of a new adventure planted, the mystery of the Midnight Star's cargo, waiting to be unraveled. But for now, watched over by the woman he loves, Mark slips into a deep, keeling sleep, his body beginning the long process of recovery from an encounter with one of nature's most perfect predators. The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors filled the air as Mark Chun slowly opened his eyes. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the sterile room. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Then, like a tidal wave, the memories of his ordeal came crashing back. Lisa stirred in the chair beside his bed, her eyes lighting up as she saw him awake. "Mark, how are you feeling?" He attempted a smile, wincing at the effort. like I went 10 rounds with a freight train. But Elias, definitely alive. Lisa's hand found his, squeezing gently. The doctors say you're doing well. Your body temperature is back to normal, and the cuts are healing nicely. Mark nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. Beyond the glass, he could see the azure expanse of the Pacific. The same ocean that had nearly claimed his life now looked deceptively peaceful. "How long was I out?" he asked, his voice still rough from salt water and exhaustion. "Almost 2 days," Lisa replied. "You woke up a few times, but you were pretty out of it. Do you remember anything?" Mark furrowed his brow, fragments of memories flitting through his mind. Bits and pieces. The shark, the storm, the rescue. He paused, a nagging thought at the edge of his consciousness. And something else, something important. Before he could grasp the elusive memory, a knock at the door interrupted them. A man in a crisp uniform entered, his face stern but not unkind. "Mr. Chun? I'm Officer Kai Melua, Honolulu PD. If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened out there." Mark nodded, shifting to sit up straighter in the bed. Lisa moved to help him, adjusting his pillows with practiced ease. Officer Malua pulled up a chair, notepad at the ready. "Can you walk me through the events leading up to your rescue? Start from the beginning, please." Mark took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "I set out early morning 2 days ago, I guess. The weather was overcast but calm. My plan was to dive the wreck of the Midnight Star, about 15 miles offshore. Alone?" Officer Malua interjected, his eyebrow raised. "Yes," Mark admitted. "I know it was risky, but I've done solo dives before. I was confident in my abilities." The officer nodded, making a note. "Go on." Mark continued, recounting his descent to the wreck, the eerie beauty of the sunken ship. His voice faltered as he described the first appearance of the shark. It was massive, bigger than any tiger shark I've ever seen or heard of. At least 15 feet, maybe more. Officer Malua whistled low. "That's exceptionally large for a tiger shark. Are you certain about the species?" Mark's eyes hardened. "Officer, I've been diving these waters for over 2 decades. I know what I saw. That shark. It wasn't just big. It was old, scarred, like it had survived 100 battles." The officer held up a placating hand. "I believe you, Mr. Chun. Please, continue." Mark described his frantic escape from the wreck, the terrifying moments trapped in the sinking ship, and his desperate swim to the surface. As he spoke, the memories became more vivid, more intense. He could almost feel the cold water closing in around him, hear the screech of metal as the shark attacked the ship. "I managed to find some floating debris," Mark said, his voice growing hoarse. "Thought I might have a chance if I could just hold on long enough for someone to find me." Lisa squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Mark squeezed back, drawing strength from her presence. But the shark, it wouldn't give up, kept circling, attacking. Each time it hit the debris, I saw it. I was sure it was over. Officer Malua leaned forward, his pen poised above the notepad. And then, Mark closed his eyes, recalling those final, desperate moments. "I heard the helicopter. It was my last chance. I knew if I stayed on the debris, they'd never see me. So I made a choice. You went back into the water," Officer Malua said, his voice tinged with awe. Mark nodded. "It was suicide. I knew that staying put was certain death. So I swam, used my dive knife to signal the chopper. And the shark." A shudder ran through Mark's body. "It came for me. One last time. I saw it coming, saw its mouth open. In that moment, I was certain I was dead." The room fell silent, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air. Even Officer Malua seemed affected, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "How did you survive?" he asked quietly. Mark shook his head, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. "Dumb luck. I dove at the last second. dealt it pass right over me. Next thing I knew, the rescue swimmer had me. Officer Malua finished jotting down notes, then closed his notepad. Thank you, Mr. Chun. Your account will be invaluable for our report. And, off the record, I'm glad you made it. As the officer stood to leave, a thought struck Mark. Wait, the Midnight Star. Did anyone recover my boat? Officer Malua nodded. Yes, we found it about 5 miles from where you were picked up. Why do you ask? Mark hesitated, glancing at Lisa. The memory that had been nagging at him suddenly crystallized. There's something down there, in the wreck. Something important. Lisa leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Mark, what are you talking about? In the captain's quarters, Mark said, his voice gaining strength. I saw a box, small, ornate. It looked out of place among the decay. I think it might be valuable. Officer Malua's expression turned serious. Mr. Chun, are you saying you found potential salvage? Mark nodded. I'm not sure what it is, but it seems significant. And given the Midnight Star's history, the officer held up a hand. I'll need to report this. Salvage laws are complex, especially for historic wrecks. For now, focus on your recovery. We'll discuss this further when you're discharged. After Officer Malua left, Lisa turned to Mark, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. A box? That's what you were trying to tell me before you passed out. Mark grasped her hand, his eyes alight with a familiar gleam of excitement. Lisa, you don't understand. The Midnight Star wasn't just any cargo ship. There were rumors, stories about what it was really carrying. Lisa sighed, recognizing the look in her husband's eyes. It was the same look he'd had before every dangerous expedition, every risky dive. Mark, you nearly died out there. You can't possibly be thinking of going back. But Mark was already lost in thought, his mind racing with possibilities. The terror of his encounter with the shark was fading, replaced by the thrill of discovery. He knew it was crazy, knew he should be grateful just to be alive. But the mystery of the Midnight Star and its hidden cargo called to him, an irresistible siren song. I have to know, Lisa, he said softly. Whatever's down there, it's important. I can feel it. Lisa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Yeah, absolutely not. You promised me, Mark. You promised you'd always come home. Mark reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. I can't do this again. I won't sit by and watch you risk your life for what? A box you glimpsed in a shipwreck. Lisa, trees, Mark started, but she was already moving towards the door. I need some air, she said, her voice tight with emotion. We'll talk about this later, when you've come to your senses. As the door closed behind her, Mark sank back into his pillows, conflicting emotions warring within him. He understood Lisa's fear, her reluctance, but the pull of the unknown was strong, a force he'd grappled with his entire life. He closed his eyes, seeing again the dark confines of the Midnight Star, the glint of metal in his flashlight beam. Whatever secret that box held, Mark knew it had the potential to change everything. The question was, at what cost? As Chapter 7 draws to a close, Mark Chun lies in his hospital bed, torn between the promise of a new adventure and the very real fears of those who love him. The shadow of the shark still looms large, a reminder of the ocean's dangers. But so too does the allure of discovery, the chance to unravel a mystery lost to time and tide. The chapter ends with Mark at a crossroads, knowing that his next decision will shape not just his future, but the lives of those around him. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across his room, Mark begins to formulate a plan, one that will lead him back into the depths, back to the Midnight Star, and the secrets that lie waiting in its rusted embrace. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast a sickly glow over Mark Chun's face as he sat on the edge of his bed, fingers fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. It had been a week since his near-death experience, and today he was finally being discharged. The physical wounds were healing, the cuts from the shark's rough skin had scabbed over, and the bruises were fading from angry purple to a mottled yellow. But the psychological scars ran deeper, manifesting in nightmares that left him drenched in sweat, heart pounding as he relived those terrifying moments in the ocean. A soft knock at the door pulled Mark from his thoughts. Lisa entered, her face a mask of concern and barely concealed frustration. "Ready to go home?" she asked, her voice gentle but strained. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "More than ready. I'm sick of hospital food and being poked and prodded." Lisa moved to help him with his shirt, her fingers brushing against his as she did up the last button. For a moment, they stood close, the tension between them palpable. Then Lisa stepped back, clearing her throat. "The car's out front. Do you need a wheelchair?" "Yeah. I can walk," Mark said, perhaps too quickly. He stood, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Lisa reached out to steady him, but he waved her off. "I'm fine. Let's just go home." The drive back to their beachfront home was silent. The only sound the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional ping of Lisa's phone as messages came in. Mark stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of Oahu roll by. The ocean glittered in the distance, beautiful and serene. It was hard to reconcile that peaceful view with the nightmarish experience he'd endured. As they pulled into the driveway, Lisa finally broke the silence. "Mark, we need to talk about what happens next." Mark tensed, knowing where this conversation was headed. "Can we at least get inside first?" Lisa nodded, cutting the engine. They made their way into the house, the comfort of home doing little to ease the tension between them. Mark sank into his favorite armchair, while Lisa perched on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid. "I've been thinking," Lisa began, her voice carefully controlled. "Maybe it's time we considered a change. A move inland, perhaps." "Yeah. Or a different line of work for you." Mark's jaw tightened. "Lisa, we've talked about this. Diving isn't just my job, it's who I am. I can't just give it up. Can't, or won't." Lisa's composure cracked, her eyes flashing with anger and fear. "Damn it, Mark. You almost died out there. Do you have any idea what that was like for me? Waiting, not knowing if you were alive or dead." Mark leaned forward, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Lisa. I know it was terrible for you. But what happened was a freak occurrence. The chances of something like that happening again are higher than you think." Lisa interrupted. She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. "While you were recovering, I did some research. Shark attacks on divers in Hawaii have increased by 30% in the last 5 years. Climate change is altering marine ecosystems, pushing sharks into new territories. And that's not even considering the risks of equipment failure, decompression sickness, or any of the other 100 things that could go wrong down there." Mark stared at the folder, a mix of emotions churning in his gut. Part of him was touched by Lisa's concern, by the effort she'd put into researching the risks he faced. But another part, the part that lived for the thrill of exploration, rebelled against the idea of giving it all up. "Lisa," he said softly, "I understand your fear, but diving, it's not just a job. It's my passion. It's how I connect with the world. Asking me to give it up, it's like asking me to stop breathing." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "And what about me, Mark? What about us? Is your passion worth more than our life together?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. How could he explain the pull of the ocean, the thrill of discovery that drove him? How could he make her understand that giving up diving would be like losing a part of himself? Before he could formulate a response, Lisa's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then back at Mark. "It's work. I have to take this." As Lisa stepped out onto the lanai to take the call, Mark's gaze drifted to the window. From here, he could see the ocean, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. Despite everything that had happened, he felt its pull, the siren song of the deep calling to him. His eyes fell on a framed photo on the bookshelf, a picture of him and Lisa on their wedding day, both beaming with joy. Next to it sat a small model of a sailing ship, a gift from his father when Mark had first expressed interest in marine exploration. The juxtaposition of the two items seemed to embody the conflict raging within him. On one side, the life he'd built with Lisa, safe and secure on land. On the other, the call of the ocean with all its dangers and wonders. Lisa returned, her face tighter than before. "That was my editor. They want me to cover a story in New York. Environmental impact of offshore drilling." Mark nodded, sensing there was more. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Lisa hesitated, then plunged ahead. I think maybe the time apart would be good for us. Give us both a chance to think about things." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He knew what Lisa was really saying. She needed space. Time to decide if she could continue living with the constant fear of losing him to the sea. "If that's what you need," he said, his voice hoarse. Lisa's eyes softened. She moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. "I love you, Mark. That's never been in question. But I need to know that you love me enough to consider a life that doesn't constantly put you in danger." Mark squeezed her hand, his heart heavy. "I'll think about it. I promise." The next few days passed in a blur of awkward silences and stilted conversations as Lisa prepared for her trip. Mark found himself spending more and more time in his study, poring over maps and charts of the area where he'd encountered the shark. Despite his promise to Lisa, he couldn't shake the memory of the ornate box he glimpsed in the wreck of the Midnight Star. The mystery of it gnawed at him, a constant itch at the back of his mind. The morning of Lisa's departure arrived all too soon. As they stood in the airport terminal, the tension between them was palpable. "Promise me you won't do anything reckless while I'm gone," Lisa said, her eyes searching his face. Mark nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I promise. Be safe. Okay? I love you." "I love you too," Lisa whispered. Then, with a final squeeze of his hand, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Mark watched until he could no longer see her, a sense of unease settling over him. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "Heard about your encounter with the tiger. Interested in discussing the Midnight Star? Meet me at the Rusty Anchor, 8 p.m. tonight." Mark's pulse quickened. He knew he should ignore it, should focus on keeping his promise to Lisa. But the lure of answers, of potentially unraveling the mystery of the Midnight Star, was too strong to resist. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mark found himself pushing open the weathered door of the Rusty Anchor. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and salt. A few grizzled regulars nursed their drinks at the bar, barely glancing up as Mark entered. In a corner booth, partially hidden by shadows, sat a man Mark recognized immediately. Captain Keone Kalani, a legend among the local diving community. His weathered face bore the marks of decades at sea, and his eyes held a gleam of both wisdom and mischief. "Mark Chun," Keone said as Mark approached, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Heard you had quite the adventure out there." Mark slid into the booth across from him. "That's one way to put it. Your message said you wanted to talk about the Midnight Star." Keone nodded, taking a sip from a glass of amber liquid. "Word gets around. Heard you found something down there. Something valuable." Mark hesitated, suddenly wary. "I'm not sure what I saw. It was just a glimpse before everything went to hell." The old captain leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The Midnight Star wasn't just any cargo ship, boy. There are stories, legends about what it was really carrying." "What kind of stories?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued despite his reservations. Keone's eyes glittered in the dim light. "They say the captain was involved in smuggling, not just goods, but artifacts, priceless treasures from all over the Pacific. The kind of stuff that could rewrite history books. Mark's mind raced, thinking back to the ornate box he'd seen. Could it really be something so significant? But here's the thing, Keone continued, leaning back in his seat. If there is treasure down there, you're not the only one interested in finding it. There are people, dangerous people who've been searching for the Midnight Star for years. A chill ran down Mark's spine. Are you saying I'm in danger? Keone shrugged, but his expression was grave. I'm saying be careful, boy. The ocean's not the only thing that can kill you out there. As Mark left the bar an hour later, his head spinning with everything Keone had told him, he knew he was at a crossroads. On one hand, he had his promise to Lisa, the chance at a safer, more stable life. On the other, the lure of discovery, the chance to uncover a piece of history long thought lost. Standing on the beach near his home, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, Mark made his decision. He would go back to the Midnight Star, but this time he'd be prepared. This time he'd uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As Chapter 8 draws to a close, Mark Chun stands on the precipice of a decision that will change his life forever. The mysteries of the Midnight Star beckon, promising adventure and danger in equal measure. Behind him lies the safety of shore, the love of his wife, and the promise of a life without risk. Ahead, the vast expanse of the Pacific, hiding secrets beneath its waves that could rewrite history. As the tide begins to turn, Mark takes a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs. He knows that come morning, he'll begin preparations for a dive that could cost him everything or reveal wonders beyond imagination. The chapter ends with Mark turning away from the ocean, walking back to his empty house with purpose in his stride, fully aware that the path he's chosen may lead to glory, ruin, or both. The pre-dawn light cast a soft glow over the docks as Mark Chun made his final preparations. His dive boat, the Sea Whisper, bobbed gently in the calm waters, loaded with state-of-the-art equipment. This time he was leaving nothing to chance. You sure about this, brah? Mark turned to see his friend and fellow diver, Kekoa, walking down the pier. Kekoa's face was etched with concern, his usual easy-going demeanor replaced by a furrowed brow. I have to do this, Kekoa, Mark replied, his voice firm. I need answers. Kekoa sighed, helping Mark load the last of the gear onto the boat. I get it, man, but after what happened last time, you're lucky to be alive. Mark paused, his hand resting on a crate of air tanks. That's why I asked you to be my surface support. I'm not going in blind this time. The two men worked in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the upcoming dive hanging heavy between them. As they finished, Kekoa placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. Lisa know you're doing this? Mark's jaw tightened. She's still in New York. I'll tell her. After, Kekoa shook his head but said nothing. They both knew the risks, both understood the potential consequences of this decision. As the sun began to peak over the horizon, Mark started the boat's engine. The familiar rumble sent a thrill of anticipation through him, mixed with a tinge of fear he couldn't quite shake. Last chance to back out, Kekoa said, his tone half choking, half pleading. Mark managed a grim smile. Not a chance. Let's go find some treasure. The journey to the dive site was tense, both men lost in their own thoughts. Mark ran through his dive plan for the 100th time, visualizing each step. He'd mapped out the wreck based on his previous experience, identifying the safest entry and exit points. As they neared the coordinates, Kekoa broke the silence. You really think there's something valuable down there? Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. Saw? And why has no one been able to salvage it in all these years? Kekoa frowned. You think someone's been protecting it? Maybe, Mark replied. Or maybe the stories about it being cursed aren't just stories. They both fell silent as the boat's GPS beeped, indicating they'd reached the dive site. The ocean here was a deep midnight blue, giving no hint of the wreck that lay 100 feet below. Mark began his final equipment check, methodically going through each piece of gear. This time he was using a rebreather system, which would allow him to stay underwater longer and with less noise, crucial if the shark was still in the area. As he prepared to enter the water, Kikoa grabbed his arm. "Mark, I gotta ask one more time. Is this worth it, man? Worth risking everything?" Mark met his friend's gaze, seeing the genuine concern there. For a moment he hesitated. Images flashed through his mind: Lisa's face, torn between love and fear. The peaceful life he could have if he just turned the boat around now. But then he remembered the box, the fleeting glimpse of something extraordinary hidden in the depths. He remembered Keone's words about the true nature of the Midnight Star's cargo. The pull of discovery was too strong to resist. "It's worth it," Mark said finally. "Some things are bigger than us, Kikoa. If what I suspect is down there is real, it could change everything." Kikoa nodded, resignation clear in his eyes. "All right, bruh. You've got 2 hours before I call in the cavalry. Any longer than that, and I'm assuming the worst." Mark clapped his friend on the shoulder, then pulled on his dive mask. With a final thumbs up, he rolled backwards off the boat, plunging into the cold embrace of the Pacific. The descent to the Midnight Star was eerily familiar. As Mark dropped through the water column, memories of his last dive here came flooding back. He pushed them aside, focusing instead on his breathing, on the gentle hiss of the rebreather. At 80 feet, the ghostly outline of the wreck came into view. Mark paused, sweeping his light across the scene. There was no sign of the shark, but he knew that meant little. The predator could appear at any moment. Moving with deliberate caution, Mark made his way to the gash in the hull he'd used as an entry point before. The damage from the shark's attack was evident. The opening was larger now. Jagged edges of metal peeled back like the petals of some monstrous flower. As he slipped inside the wreck, Mark's senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the enclosed space. He navigated the corridors from memory, making his way towards the captain's quarters where he glimpsed the mysterious box. Halfway there, Mark froze. A sound echoed through the ship, a metallic scraping that didn't belong. He killed his light, pressing himself against a wall, straining to hear. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving through the wreck. Mark's mind raced. Had the shark somehow gotten inside? But no, the sound was too deliberate, too controlled. With a jolt of shock, he realized the truth. He wasn't alone down here. Moving with extreme caution, Mark edged forward, following the sound. As he neared the captain's quarters, he saw a faint glow emanating from within. Someone was inside, searching. Mark's heart pounded. Who could be down here? How had they known about the box? He thought back to Keone's warning about dangerous people interested in the Midnight Star's secrets. Peering around the doorframe, Mark saw a figure hunched over the safe where he'd seen the box. The diver was working quickly, using a small torch to cut through the corroded metal. For a moment, Mark was torn. Should he confront the intruder? Try to stop them from taking whatever was inside? Or should he retreat? Report what he'd seen to the authorities? The decision was made for him when the diver suddenly stiffened, sensing Mark's presence. They spun around, torch raised like a weapon. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw the diver's eyes widen behind their mask, saw their hand move towards a knife strapped to their leg. In that instant, Mark knew he had to act. He lunged forward, grabbing the diver's arm before they could draw the knife. The two grappled in the confined space, a silent, deadly dance. Mark's greater size gave him an advantage, but the other diver was quick, skilled. As they struggled, Mark's elbow struck the safe. The weakened metal gave way, and suddenly, the ornate box he glimpsed before tumbled out. It hit the floor of the cabin and sprung open, spilling its contents. Both divers froze, staring in awe at what lay before them. Gleaming in the light of their torches was a collection of small figurines, each intricately carved from what looked like pure gold. But it was more than just their material value that struck Mark. He recognized the style, the symbols etched into their bases. These were artifacts from a civilization long thought lost to time. proof of a culture that predated all known Polynesian settlements. It was the kind of discovery that could rewrite history books. The moment of shared wonder was broken when the other diver made a grab for the artifacts. Mark reacted instinctively, knocking the diver's hand away. In the process, he caught a glimpse of a tattoo on the diver's wrist, a stylized shark, its mouth open in a perpetual snarl. Recognition hit Mark like a physical blow. He'd seen that symbol before, in Keone's tales of a secretive organization obsessed with recovering lost Pacific treasures. An organization that wouldn't hesitate to kill to keep their finds secret. The fight resumed with renewed intensity. Mark knew he couldn't let these artifacts fall into the wrong hands. Whatever their historical value, they belonged to the people of Hawaii, not in some private collection. As they grappled, neither diver noticed the change in the water around them. The silt they disturbed had created a cloud, obscuring their vision. And in that cloud, something massive was moving. Mark felt it first, a shift in the current, a presence that sent a primal jolt of fear through him. He broke away from the other diver, spinning to face the new threat. There, in the doorway of the captain's quarters, was the tiger shark. Its massive form barely fit through the opening, its black eyes fixed on the two divers with predatory focus. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, with a powerful sweep of its tail, the shark charged. Mark reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed the other diver, pulling them both down as the shark's jaws snapped shut where they'd been moments before. The force of the attack sent tremors through the weakened structure of the ship. In the chaos that followed, Mark lost track of the other diver. His world narrowed to a series of desperate maneuvers, barely avoiding the shark's repeated attacks. He caught glimpses of gold as the artifacts were scattered in the turbulence, but he had no time to think about recovering them. With the shark blocking the door, Mark knew their only chance was to find another way out. He spotted a small porthole, barely big enough for a diver to squeeze through. Without hesitation, Mark made for the opening. As he reached it, he glanced back. The other diver was pinned in a corner, the shark circling for another attack. Mark knew he should leave them. This diver was likely a criminal, someone who wouldn't hesitate to kill him for the artifacts. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the diver's obvious terror, or maybe it was simply that Mark couldn't bring himself to leave another human to such a fate. With a curse that sent a stream of bubbles through his regulator, Mark shot back into the room. He grabbed the other diver's arm, dragging them towards the porthole. "Dal!" he shouted, the sound muffled by the water and their gear. The other diver hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. They began to squeeze through the opening. Mark turned to face the shark, his dive knife held out before him. He knew it was a pitiful defense against such a massive predator, but it was all he had. The shark charged again, its mouth open wide. Mark braced himself, ready to strike. But at the last second, the shark veered off, attracted by something shiny tumbling through the water, one of the scattered artifacts. Not wasting the opportunity, Mark bolted for the porthole. He could see the other diver outside, gesturing frantically for him to hurry. With a final burst of strength, Mark squeezed through the opening. His tank caught for a heart-stopping moment, then came free with a screech of tearing metal. As soon as he was clear, Mark began to ascend, the other diver beside him. They'd need to make a decompression stop, but right now, putting distance between themselves and the shark was the priority. As they rose through the water column, Mark's mind whirled. The artifacts scattered and possibly destroyed. The shark, still lurking in the wreck. And beside him, a diver who might be an enemy, might be a reluctant ally. When they finally broke the surface, Mark was surprised to see two boats, his own Sea Whisper, and another sleek vessel he didn't recognize. Kikoa was waving frantically from the Sea Whisper, relief evident on his face. As they were pulled aboard their respective boats, Mark locked eyes with the other diver. For a moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever their differences, they'd faced death together in the depths. The other diver nodded once, then their boat's engine roared to life. Before Mark could say anything, they were speeding away, leaving nothing but a wake on the calm surface of the ocean. Kikoa helped Mark remove his gear, peppering him with questions. But Mark was quiet, his mind still processing everything that had happened. As they turned to Sea Whisper towards home, Mark gazed back at the spot where the Midnight Star lay hidden beneath the waves. The artifacts were lost, perhaps forever, but he had seen them, had held in his hands proof of a history yet to be written. And somewhere out there, another diver carried the same knowledge. Mark had a feeling their paths would cross again. Whether as enemies or allies remained to be seen. For now, he had a call to make. It was time to tell Lisa everything. As Chapter 9 draws to a close, Mark Chun stands at the helm of the Sea Whisper, battered but alive. The mysteries of the Midnight Star have only deepened, promising more danger and adventure to come. Behind him lies a shattered wreck, a relentless predator, and scattered remnants of a priceless historical treasure. Ahead, the shore beckons, along with the reckoning he knows he must face with Lisa. The chapter ends with Mark taking a deep breath of salt air, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knows that his life has changed irrevocably, that the path ahead is fraught with peril. But as the first rays of sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Mark allows himself a small smile, for in the depths of the Pacific, he had touched history and lived to tell the tale. The sun was setting over Honolulu as Mark Chun stood on the lanai of his beachfront home, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The beauty of the scene before him, the sky ablaze with oranges and pinks, the ocean a glittering expanse of gold, was lost on him. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief at having survived, frustration at the loss of the artifacts, and an overwhelming sense of dread about the conversation he was about to have. The sliding door behind him opened with a soft hiss. Mark didn't need to turn to know it was Lisa. He'd heard her car pull up a few minutes ago, had steeled himself for this moment. Marked. Lisa's voice was tentative, a mix of concern and something else, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. He turned to face her, taking in the sight of his wife. She looked tired, the strain of the past weeks evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the tight set of her jaw. But to Mark, she was as beautiful as ever. "Han," he said softly. "How was New York?" Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. Don't. Kikoa called me Mark. He told me everything." Mark's heart sank. He'd hoped to break the news himself, to explain his actions before Lisa heard it from someone else. But of course Kikoa would have called her. He was looking out for both of them. "Lisa, I can explain." "Explain what, exactly?" Lisa's voice rose, the calm facade cracking. "How you broke your promise. How you risked your life again for what? Some sunken treasure." Mark ran a hand through his salt-stiffened hair, searching for the right words. "It wasn't just treasure, Lisa. What I found down there, it could change everything we know about Pacific history. And that's worth dying for?" Lisa's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Worth leaving me a widow?" The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He moved towards Lisa, reaching out to her. When she stepped back, shaking her head. "Don't, Achin, I can't do this right now." She turned away, her shoulders shaking slightly. "I need some time to think. I don't know. Just give me some space, Mark." Before he could respond, Lisa had disappeared back into the house. A moment later, he heard the bedroom door close with a decisive click. Mark slumped into a chair, the weight of everything crashing down upon him. He'd known there would be consequences for his actions, but facing them was harder than he'd imagined. The thrill of discovery, the adrenaline of the dive, it all seemed hollow now, set against the pain he'd caused Lisa. As the last light faded from the sky, Mark made a decision. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could try to make Lisa understand. And to do that, he needed to start at the beginning. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself up and went to his study. There, he began to write, pouring out everything that had happened since that first fateful dive to the Midnight Star. He wrote about the terror of the shark attack, the mystery of the artifacts, the confrontation with the other diver. More than that, he tried to capture the why of it all, the unquenchable thirst for discovery that drove him. The need to uncover truths long hidden by time and tide. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting long shadows across the study. Mark's hand cramped, but still he wrote. It was dawn by the time he finished. The pages spread out before him like a roadmap of his obsession. Exhausted but somehow lighter, Mark gathered the pages and went to the bedroom. He hesitated at the door, then gently knocked. "Lisa, I know you said you needed space, but I've written everything down. What happened, why I did it. I'll leave it here for you to read when you're ready. I need you to understand." There was no response from the other side of the door. Mark placed the stack of papers on the floor and retreated to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. Within moments, he was asleep, the exhaustion of the past days finally catching up to him. When Mark awoke, the sun was high in the sky. For a moment, he was disoriented, the events of the previous day feeling like a distant dream. Then reality came crashing back. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and froze. Lisa was sitting in the armchair across from him, the stack of papers in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, evidence of tears shed, but her expression was unreadable. "Lisa, She held up a hand, stopping him. "I read it, all of it." She took a deep breath, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I still don't agree with what you did, Mark. You broke your promise to me, put yourself in incredible danger. But I think I understand a little better now." Mark leaned forward, hope blooming in his chest. "You too." Lisa nodded slowly. "This passion, this drive to discover, it's part of who you are. I've always known that. I fell in love with that part of you." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "But Mark, love isn't always enough. Not when it comes with this kind of fear, this constant worry that each goodbye might be our last." The hope in Mark's chest withered. "What are you saying, Lisa?" She stood, moving to sit beside him on the couch. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. "I'm saying we need to figure this out, together, because I can't live like this, constantly terrified that you won't come home. But I also can't ask you to give up something that's so fundamentally a part of who you are." Mark turned to face her fully, his heart pounding. "What do we do?" Lisa managed a small, sad smile. "I don't know, but I think we start by being honest. Completely honest. No more secrets, no more solo missions. If you're going to dive, I want to know everything. The risks, the rewards, all of it." "I can do that," Mark said quickly. "Lisa, I swear, I'll never keep anything from you again." She nodded, then took a deep breath. "And I think I need to come with you sometimes." Mark blinked, surprised. "Come with me? But you've never shown interest in diving before." "I haven't," Lisa agreed. "But maybe that's been part of the problem. This whole world you inhabit, I've been separate from it. Maybe if I understand it better, if I'm a part of it somehow, it won't seem so terrifying." Mark considered this, turning the idea over in his mind. Having Lisa involved in his dives, even just on the boat as surface support, could change everything. It was a risk. Bringing her into that world meant exposing her to its dangers. But it also meant sharing his passion with her in a way he never had before. "Okay," he said finally. "If you're sure that's what you want, we can start small. Maybe some shallow dives in calm waters, just to get you comfortable with the gear." Lisa nodded, a hint of a genuine smile touching her lips. "I'd like that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling around them. Then Lisa spoke again, her tone serious. "There's something else we need to discuss, Mark. These artifacts you saw, the other diver, if what you've written is true, this is bigger than just us. Have you considered going to the authorities?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought about it, but without the artifacts as proof, it's just my word. And bringing attention to the Midnight Star might attract the wrong kind of people. That organization, the other divers seem to be part of their dangerous. Lisa, I don't want to put us in their crosshairs. Lisa's brow furrowed. So what do we do? Just sit on this information? Mark shook his head. No, I think we need to do more research. Quietly. If we can find out more about the Midnight Star, about these artifacts, maybe we can build a case strong enough to take to the authorities. Or to a reputable museum or university. Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow. Mark met her gaze steadily. Yes, if you're serious about being more involved, then I want you with me every step of the way. Your skills as a journalist could be invaluable in this kind of investigation. For the first time since she'd returned, a spark of excitement lit Lisa's eyes. You're right. I have contacts, resources we could use. We'd need to be careful, of course, but we'd be doing it together, Mark finished. Lisa nodded, then leaned in, resting her head on Mark's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, reveling in the simple comfort of her presence. I'm still angry with you, Lisa murmured, and scared, but I love you, Markshan. God help me, I do. Mark pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I love you too, more than any treasure, any discovery. I'm sorry it took nearly losing everything to realize that. As they sat there, the sound of the ocean a constant presence in the background, Mark felt a shift. The pull of the deep was still there, the siren song of undiscovered wonders. But now it was balanced by something equally powerful, the love of the woman in his arms, and the promise of a shared adventure. The mystery of the Midnight Star was far from solved. Dangers still lurked in the depths, both natural and human. But as Mark held Lisa, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As Chapter 10 draws to a close, Mark and Lisa-chan stand at the threshold of a new chapter in their lives. The wounds of broken trust are still fresh, the path forward uncertain. But there is hope now, a shared determination to bridge the gap between Mark's passion for the ocean and Lisa's need for security. The chapter ends with them still on the couch, quietly discussing plans for Lisa's first dive lesson. Outside, the ocean stretches to the horizon, its surface calm but its depth still hiding untold secrets. And somewhere out there, the Midnight Star waits, its treasures scattered but not forgotten. A siren call to those who would dare to uncover the truths hidden beneath the waves.